Hello. So just a heads up, there was a formatting switch up, so some of the slides are going to be in slightly random order. So I guess the way I kind of want to structure this is I may end up missing some things. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to just ask them in the moment. I think they've got to come out and get you a microphone for when you ask them, but just ask them right away and we'll make it more conversational. So I'm just kind of going to go through how it all got started, and then I'm kind of going to explain what it is today, because the two are really different. Back in winter of 2011, I met my co-founder, Darren McCleskey. We had both ended up at this meeting for a student organization that's called the Detroit Partnership. They had been advertising urban agriculture all over campus. We both actually saw the same sign posted above a urinal. It was clever positioning, actually. And so we both went because, it seemed cool. And, as is often the case with a lot of student organizations, they really became well known for their annual day of service and had a really hard time maintaining sort of regular weekly or monthly involvement. And so Darren and I had both sort of asked the same questions. How are you going to do agriculture if this is happening one day a year? And they were really cool about it, and they were like, we know, you should come every week. But we ended up finding each other afterwards. At the time, I think Darren was 19 and I was 20. And we just started chatting. Darren, by the way, we were both undergrads. He was in a civil and environmental engineering combined program. I was in social psych. And we both kind of liked plants. So I'm talking with Darren, and he's going on and on about Detroit. And just so you guys know, I'm from Ann Arbor originally. I grew up there, and it wasn't until I was 20 years old that I realized that Detroit even had skyscrapers in it. That's really just how segregated Michigan is. I guess it's communities within the state. I really thought it was the airport. I was just talking about this with somebody. And so this guy, Darren, he's 19, and he's talking all about how Detroit is the coolest place ever. And I'm just like, what are you talking about? That is where mom and dad said do not go. And he's just going on about it. And it turns out he owns property in it, and he's 19, and I just think that that's the strangest thing. So I guess my curiosity is piqued at that point, but there's not any real need for me to take any sort of action, right? Seems cool. Kind of in an unrelated way, I ended up taking a research position with the Urban Community Oral Health Intervention Project. My job was to recruit women of color who had children under the age of 5 who made less than 10 grand a year and used the services of the WIC office, which is a government subsidy program specific for women with infant kids. I recruited over 200 individuals in that demographic. I was testing these modules. It had this thing that looked like a knockoff Big Bird, and it was talking in this semi-condescending way. And it was running these educational modules looking at nutritional literacy, oral health practices, and dental anxiety. And in that experience, I ended up getting, I guess, a lot more than I thought I was going to. Very regularly, I would have women with infant kids coming in. They'd have the child with their baby bottle, and in it would be soda pop. And if you asked this question, hey, what are you doing? This is really bad. They just didn't know. We have it in Michigan. I don't know if you guys have it here. It's called Faygo. It's like soda pop. It's just a brand, and orange Faygo is a big thing. But often, as it turns out, people mistake it for being orange juice. And that's a more extreme example, but the reality is, in our modern food system, clever marketing can really just undermine well-intending people, especially ones with infant kids. And so I guess through that experience, I was all riled up, having this existential crisis where, I can't just go and do my homework because that's happening. And so I had, at the time, been working landscaping jobs just to kind of pay or make money through college, and Darren and I's kind of like shared love of agriculture, or at least our understanding of it, sort of sparked the idea of, this is my like super dramatic and supposed to be like playful slide, like ding, idea, oh my God, we should just do these community gardens and like end food security in Detroit. And that, like, that's really what we thought, right? And there's something really important to that, and I think this is something that often goes really unspoken, is that you can't know what you're getting into, right? I mean, if I knew back then what I knew now, I mean, I would never start something, right? I mean, it's exhausting, the problems are complicated. I mean, you have to be just like blissfully naive and probably a little arrogant to think you can actually like make some social change in the world. And so like that's what happened, right? Like we just went in with this idea that we were going to like end food insecurity with like a single community garden, like zero understanding of like X number of pounds from X amount of space, and oh, there's like 700,000 people in Detroit. So we ended up, so there's this like metaphor I like to use. It involves this clip art ball of yarn. I think a really good way to sort of get introduced to problems is to think of it like finding a piece of string on the floor. Like you see it and you're like, that shouldn't be there, and you pick it up and you just sort of kind of like winding it around your hand, and all of a sudden you realize, you know, it goes into the next room, and you know, it's longer and deeper than you originally thought, right? But you've already started. I mean, it's actually like a social psych pitfall called sunken costs, where you've started something, and because you've started, you're willing to continue to do it even to the point where it becomes maladaptive to your health, but like that's its own thing. And that's how, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like that's how you need to get introduced to problems, right? Like just simple, like I want to fix this, it seems like something I can do, and like that's how you get started. And so I guess as like I go through this, I just want that framework to kind of be like on everybody's minds, that is very much the narrative here, right? It's just people like with nothing but idealism and zero experience, just like going at it and getting in trouble and making poor choices along the way. So our first exciting poor choice, we love it, was the purchase of this building. So, right, we had this idea that we were going to like end food security with community gardens, and somehow that turned into us buying a building. We got this for $5,025 in the tax auction. We won the bid by $5 and cleaned out Darren and my's combined personal savings. But that was like the start, right? I mean, once we had done that, like all of a sudden it could be more than just community gardens, right? I mean, it could be a center. It could be, I don't know, like workshop space. You know, the possibilities were endless. And this is very much like a theme in Detroit right now, is that, you know, depending on like what your social position is, there is a lot of opportunity to do interesting new things that you wouldn't have the ability to do elsewhere, right? I mean, in what world do two like 20-year-olds get to go buy a building when they don't know anything about buildings or like anything at all, right? So here we are. I think it's probably 6 months after Darren and I had met, and we ended up actually hosting Volunteers for Detroit Partnership Day. This was like the big opening of the nonprofit, kind of this like fun little twist that we met at a Detroit Partnership Day meeting, and then they all ended up on our site that we had created before that workday even happened. So, I mean, like just being up front, like it was like 100 frat boys in buses like drove up to Detroit, and we were just gonna like build a garden. You can see it in this photo a little bit, but the area north of the structure, it's actually completely all paved. At the time, we did not know that was the space slated for our agriculture, our, you know, exciting community garden. And day one, within 5 minutes, we, you know, got the shovels out. We got all the like 100 volunteers prepped and ready to go, and within seconds, right? I mean, it was just like ding, oh my God, no. So it turns out that was a gas station 20 years ago. The tanks are still buried under the ground. And in fact, it is the only space on our entire site that has high, questionable levels of contamination. I mean, it's like the only place that you would not want to plant and eat things. So that was like an interesting point for us, right? So we're like, all right, we're really just not, we're spinning our wheels here. We need to kind of make something productive happen. So this kind of turned into our first year, not growing, but just figuring out where we could be useful. And we found that, and maybe this was just because it was a platform I was comfortable with, but we ended up just landscaping. Every Saturday we would show up. I mean, it would look literally like this, right? We'd have a bunch of sturdy or not so sturdy students from the university come and just move things that had been neglected for a very long time. Just to give you guys some background, Detroit currently has 40 square miles of vacant land. There's 90,000 blighted homes. There's just space that hasn't been touched in a decade, right? So you've got an enormous amount of growth. When we had gotten there weren't visible sidewalks. The curb line extended a few feet into the street. There was just so much debris that had built up over time that it was really just an excavation job, right? Let's find the original footprint of this area. And so this is kind of what year one looked like. And this next photo is a little out of place, but this was our original marketing strategy. But I mean, this is what it looked like, right? Realistically, it was a bunch of young white guys and occasionally some females coming into Detroit on buses and just hauling ass. I mean, there was something kind of beautiful about it. I mean, I don't think, people criticize things like parachute volunteering all the time, but when you are doing it every day, I mean, you get underwater with it, and there's just something really pure about having people who are just so blissfully unaware of the problems that they think they can fix them, right? I mean, we were bringing in busloads of frat boys every weekend, and they were just going to town. It had a pretty remarkable impact visually, right? And this is really where our value in year one was just creating a consistent presence of something noticeably different, right? I mean, having a well-maintained space carries a lot of weight with people. I mean, it helps you organize, I don't know. There's a lot of psychological things that go along with well-maintained space. I mean, right, it was very hillbilly, actually. I think we had all these angsty, early 20 feelings that everybody just kind of got out during these work days. It's very different now. I'm getting all sentimental just thinking about it, right? I would just show up and just go to town, and now it's oh my God, the real problems. I know what they are. I'm actually just gonna swing through here. Over that first year, good things happened, right? We started talking with our neighbors. They were hey, you guys kept coming back. Let's have a conversation. Let's be friends. We ended up doing these yoga things on site. People were interested. It got pretty cool, actually. So, where do we stand today? In the last 3 years, I guess our purpose and existence has really evolved. We originally just wanted to feed people, and we realized that the skill set that we had and the potential for impact available to us wasn't necessarily just in increasing access to local produce. What we did have was a really fantastic network of students with professional skill sets in the works. One of the major challenges in Detroit right now is the urban infrastructure, modern day. So there's a lot of just very old things and not a lot of people that know how to work with them. And we've really kind of found ourselves at this intersection between addressing structural inequality in the food system through the increased increased economic access to locally sourced organic produce, and then also really just driving innovation in what's called blue and green infrastructure. So, I mean, kind of my like working line now is we're focused on this 2 square block space that's got about a dozen different things going on. It's weird because I like see 2 slides and I can't see what you guys are seeing. So one is just increasing access to produce, and the other is working with blighted urban infrastructure and trying to create scalable models that serve some sort of like immediately functional purpose. This is our site currently. So I'm only going to list 9 projects here, and this is like a few different views on it. Oh, I'm just going to go through actually the farm right now, because that seems to be the order these things are in. So here is an example of one of the lots. We'd actually begun the process, right? You can see where all the sidewalks are. But over the course of a couple of years, you can kind of see how we just kept growing. It's cool to like look back and think on this stuff. I mean, we literally had no idea what we were doing, and then snow happens. Do you guys get snow in Arkansas? Okay, so you know. You know, there's some like fun festive things you can do over the winter time. People love festivities. It's kind of awesome.
What is the intersection with brush that you're on your next to the Fisher building in the background?
It is, yeah. So we've got Woodward and West Grand, which is pretty much where the Fisher building is. We are 2 blocks northeast, so it's Woodward, John R. Brush, and then it's West Grand, Horton, and Custer. We're sandwiched between Horton and Custer. I realize I also take a lot of photos, and that's also just to prove that because Google Maps doesn't have our farm actually in the sky view yet, but Bing Maps does. I just wanted to like throw it out there. So here's pretty much how the farm works, right? We've got this like, it's only a couple acres and we've managed to get 25,000 pounds of produce out of it without being terribly strategic in how we're doing it, right? I mean, you saw how it grew. We were just like, all right, well, we'll add on some more, right? So right now, it's going to one of 4 locations. First priority is individual households. We use this pay what you can suggested donation model. So essentially at any given time, people can come onto the site. We'll harvest alongside them, weight out by variety, and then make a suggested donation based off market value. And it's strictly pay what you can. What's interesting about this is that they say the suggested donation models can only work in areas with extremely like disparate economic communities where you have like a wealthier class that subsidizes the lower income class, but we're making more than we're asking for in an area that is strictly low income. So it's just kind of like an interesting metric for demand. We also supply things like local markets. Right up the street, we've got the Oakland Avenue Farmers Market, which is owned by a nonprofit. Well, it's like a subsidiary program of the nonprofit. We're also going to places like Eastern Market or local churches. There's a lot of pop-up markets that happen. Third priority is local vendors, so we'll supply things like restaurants and grocery stores. And then anything that we don't send to one of those first 3 categories, we will just straight up donate to the Coalition on Temporary Shelters or Forgotten Harvest, which is kind of like a cool way to work with it. You know, in Detroit, you've got like a pretty large urban ag scene, and there tends to be these like niche urban ag groups. Like one uses it strictly for like political activism. Another will use it strictly for profit. Another will use it strictly for like community building and placemaking. And I think we try and really incorporate all 3 of those because at the end of the day, I mean, the site that we're trying to create, it's all about creating like a destination, right? I mean, urban ag is under a lot of pressure right now to justify itself economically. It is there is a reason that like agriculture tends to be in rural areas, right? I mean, it takes up a lot of square footage. Say we've got 1 acre of space and we do 12,000 pounds of produce on that in 1 year, and say it's all like primo heirloom tomatoes, non-GMO, like cream of the crop, and we're selling it to Whole Foods, top of the line, you know, biggest pay we can get. That's only going to be like 60 grand a year, right? That's like at $5 a pound. It's really hard to justify using a full acre for something like that. And that's something we're really like having an interesting time navigating. Why did I start going into this? So the reason is, I'll get into that in a minute. So there's, you know, I don't know how like tuned in everyone here is with like what's going on in Detroit, but it's very much past that rock bottom, and like now it's, you know, developers are like descending on the land. And urban ag, you know, in and of itself is very much tied up into like land ownership and land politics, right? I mean, it's all about autonomy and having control over like your future, and really being the active agent like in your physical space around you. But a lot of the groups, you know, us included, are working on a wide variety of space, or like for 1 acre, we've got 30 separate parcels, probably 10 different categories of ownership on those parcels. So some are going to be like private individuals, some are going to be like corporations, some are going to be like government. The point here is that if you really actually wanted to like get something started in Detroit, you could either wait for 10 years and then it may not happen, or you could just kind of like say, all right, I'm gonna just do something on this land. But that like puts you in this weird, precariously vulnerable position, right? Where you're like, all right, so we've spent 3 years managing to acquire every single privately owned property, which included a structure that was purchased by a man in California through the tax auction who put it in the name of a fake nonprofit, who then went to jail. It went through like 4 separate like foreclosure companies. We ultimately ended up getting the structure from a oil baron out of Texas who didn't even know he owned it and gave it to us for $1, right? I mean, like this took us 3 years, and this is just like a blighted structure that we're just trying to do something with. It's kind of this impossible situation where you kind of just like have to put yourself in a weird spot. So now that Detroit's kind of like on this development kick, and that the like government administration has decided that development is the priority, they're funneling all of the government and city-owned and state-owned land into one entity called the Detroit Land Bank Authority. And their job is kind of to like, one, streamline the process of getting government-owned land doing something other than like sitting, but also to sort of like serve this land up like to developers on a silver platter. And actually an issue that we're facing right now is that all of the sudden they have decided that like our farm is like the greatest thing that ever could have happened to a developer because of the number of like contiguous vacant parcels. And so they are like all about making us disappear. Never mind, there's still like 40 like vacant square miles here, really? Like, are you serious? But it all comes down to like, you know, money. I get that they're like in a weird position. It's a thing. I'll get into that like some other time, and it'll be angry, I'm sure. But here's just like an example. You know, we've got people that live, these guys live right in view of the site. Actually, the one on the left is Pinky. She is our farm manager now. That is one of the first times I met her, when she and her brother Orlando were picking some produce. This is the Oakland Avenue Farmers Market. What you see here, I mean, like this maybe doesn't look like the farmers markets you'll see in like other big cities. I mean, it's literally just like people pitching up tents and like let's make it work. Here is the Coalition on Temporary Shelters. I just like the way the produce was displayed. All right, now to the fun stuff. So here's our building. Now it has a mural on it. We've been around for 3.5 years. We still don't have a flushing toilet. It's a real thing. All of the stories you've heard about the water department are completely true. They are so dysfunctional. I shouldn't be saying this out loud. It's miserable. I mean, like a group of like motivated, arguably entitled like 20-somethings should have been able to navigate getting a toilet that flushes in 3.5 years. We're working on it. So here's like the background on the problems that I guess like really characterizes some of the work that we're doing. We've got blight, right? So actually now it's 80,000 because they've demoed 10,000. We've got a ton of blighted structures. They're all over the place. The ownership is really confusing. The city's right now paying between 10 and 15 grand per structure to demolish them. They're hiring out-of-state contractors. They're sending materials to landfills. Every part of this process is really begging for improvement, but it's not the government's job to, really pilot stuff and try and innovate, right? Like they need to do what they know works because like there aren't that many taxpayer dollars available and like you cannot waste things in Detroit, even though that ends up happening a lot. One of the bigger problems at the end of the day, right, is that like if you demo a property, you're just creating more vacant land, and you'd think like as an urban ag group that we'd be more interested in like increasing the amount of contiguous vacant land, but we're not, right? Like we're all about adaptive reuse of what's called the built environment. We don't want more vacant land. I mean, this is like a major metropolitan area. We like the, 100-year-old homes and, maybe some of it's like a little artsy and bohemian because it's like very, post-apocalyptic at times, but, we don't want everything to just get demoed and like thrown into a landfill. But the government's kind of got its hands tied because blight is one of the biggest problems, right? I mean, like nobody wants to move in next door to a blighted home. They tend to generate a lot of illegal activity. They're not good things overall. Adding on to that, we've got really, really, really dated city infrastructure. So we've got one of the oldest sewer systems in the country. They don't even do these things anymore. They're called combined systems, where it's just like supplying an enormous area. And the reason you don't do this anymore is because like if one thing goes wrong, what is it? Like 946 square miles, 3 million people are all going to suffer. Like this is why they localize this stuff now. I mean, technically, if you wanted to like backfill into the sewer line, you could like, this is why it is illegal to tap your fire hydrants, right? Like you could really end up messing up some people's lives. Sewer lines are a problem. They can't handle the current load that like periods of heavy rainfall will put on them. When it does get like too much, what they do is they just open up the sewer lines into the Detroit River. So because it's a combined system, you've got the sewage and the stormwater running together. And so it's just like pumping raw sewage into the Detroit River, which is pretty raunchy, but they don't have any other options, right? Like Detroit is just, it's doing what it can from a government standpoint, but it's not good. This is kind of like only getting worse, right? Like this isn't going to get better overnight. There aren't any real solutions other than to just like stop water from going into them. And then we've also just got these like major humanitarian issues with access to water overall. People are paying too much money for water. The water department is super dysfunctional. They're doing shutoffs like nonstop. There was a period where they just, wouldn't enforce any of your delinquent utilities, which at the end of the day turned into like a worse system. It kind of like perpetuated the problem that it wanted to fix in the first place. I'm like saying a lot of random things. So the point is, right, we've got a ton of blighted homes. Our current like city infrastructure can't handle just the load that a city that's only at half the population it was designed for generates. It's not getting any better, and we've got some issues in terms of like individual access. How this ties into kind of the future of Detroit is we've got this thing called the Detroit Future City Framework, It's essentially a blueprint that's supposed to shape development for the next 50 years, right? They've done this like intensive amount of research, talked to a gajillion people, and essentially developed all of these land use typologies. An example of that would be like green infrastructure. So that would be a category of land use, and an example of that would be an urban farm, right? Or like a breezeway where you've just got like a bunch of trees that are like disrupting wind patterns. It's cool. What's cool about it is that it slated all of this area in Detroit for blue and green infrastructure. It's a pretty like progressive, I guess, way of doing development. We as overall tend to be pretty big fans of it. Honestly, I'm just gonna like jump into the stuff that we're doing. So how this all ties in, we've got a bunch of blighted properties on our property, blighted structures on our property that we're working with. Here's one of them. This is 325 Horton. This is actually the one that we got from the oil baron. This would cost $10,000 to $15,000 to demolish. At the end of the day, you'd have a vacant piece of land. One of the major costs in demolition is removing the foundation and utility lines. So there's kind of this need to figure out ways of repurposing those materials. But you can't exactly take it down and then stick a new house on it, because there's a ton of just like red tape surrounding it that immediately makes that idea cost prohibitive. So what we're doing, which is cool, essentially we're taking the structure down to its foundation. So, right, you've just got like the bricks. I don't know how they build homes here, but in Detroit you tend to have like 4 feet of your basement above ground, 4 feet below. We are gonna apply a rubber coating over that, effectively like waterproofing it and turning it into a large bowl, which will effectively retain water. So one, that's kind of interesting, right? Because we're able to hold water from going down the sewer lines, and then have the potential to do something with it. If you want to add more value, you can build these things called like just catchment systems. It's like you funnel or angle some tarps that'll essentially funnel the water into it, and you can increase the like overall surface area that it's funneling water in from. Finally, the real cool part is you can just take like a simple motor and stick it on the back of that thing. I don't know if you are putting it together, but behind it, that is a corner of our farm. You could just stick in a simple like soaker hose drip irrigation system and effectively remove the burden of having to pay for water on adjacent green infrastructure in a way where these two things are working in tandem together. Also benefit the city because you're reducing like the amount of water that's going down the sewer lines. And at the end of the day, we're doing it. We've pretty much already done it. I shouldn't say that though, because we didn't pull a permit for one thing, which we're gonna do. And in case anybody asks me about it. But we're doing it at the end of the day for about $3,000, which is, what is that, like a third or a fifth of the cost that the city's currently paying to just demolish properties and turn them into vacant parcels. That's like pretty exciting. I don't know, I get really excited about that. Probably.
Okay, and do you have roofing that's going into it so that you're collecting it from other than the square footage that it's footprinted?
Right, so right now our plan is just to do these like artsy catchment systems where it looks like a bunch of umbrellas got smashed together, and like it's called modern art, but it just happens to be oriented in a way that like funnels everything down. What we've been real interested in, I don't know if you can see it in this photo, but there's some pretty big trees behind it. We've been thinking about maybe doing like an artificial tree. I mean, like you could just stick like a cone in it, right? That was something the size of a tree. I don't know. Yes, the surface area is going to be increased. No, the like legalities around building giant things that take up a lot of airspace have not been like figured out yet. We're working on it.
So the membrane you're putting in is in the interior of the basement?
Yeah, so I mean, effectively, it's just a pond liner, right? And then, we're gonna have to like put in some like railing or something. I'm sure it'll get regulated like a pool or something, maybe a pond. I'm sure the city will have a problem with it for something. Things aren't really regulated in Detroit, just so everybody is knowing where we're coming from. I mean, we were actively encouraged by, nope, not gonna say it out loud. Nope. So next thing, we've got a few of these examples. So for those of you who don't know, this is a hoop house. I mean, hoop house, greenhouse, it's pretty much the same difference. You grow plants in it, right? Like the goal of it is just to create a greenhouse effect and keep stuff warm. Kind of like a throwback to some Native American traditions. A tribe, I think it's a tribe, I could be like messing up my terminology here, but they essentially just did these underground greenhouses, and it's handy, right? Because you're like taking advantage of the increased thermal mass of like sinking something below ground. We'd originally actually slated the retention pond thing for the same idea. I mean, why wouldn't we just retrofit a hoop house onto the foundation of an existing home? It's a great way to make use of the space that potentially can generate revenue. And additionally, if you want to talk about deconstruction, I mean, there's all parts of houses that you could use, essentially creating like a parcel strategy for generating revenue, right? I mean, like we take this house apart, we've got like windows for cold frames. You can use the flat stock or pine sheathing for like a basket weave style fencing, wires for orchards, bricks are good for everything. They are perfectly square or rectangular. And at the end of the day, you can really orient these around more background. So Detroit's got like a highly varied soil composition per parcel. I mean, you've got like a space where you've like often seen houses get demoed. There's like a ton of sand happening, or like just topsoil, but it's naturally just full of clay. But within a given parcel, I mean, you can have like 5 different unique like combinations of these. And in each of those, I mean, there's going to be like a different type of crop that thrives. But if you can sort of identify these, because they follow pretty consistent patterns, you can really take advantage of that and just kind of like create a cash crop centered like planting guide that's also kind of incorporating this hoop house idea. We did a bunch of research behind it. I mean, actually, no, we read this thing, and a like novice hoop house farming thing. Pretty much, if you're good at what you do, you can make up to $23 an hour. It means you'd be doing like 5 hours a week of work, which is really, if you're effective with agriculture, you can get it to that point, especially with such a small space. The idea here is just, instead of like spending 15 grand to create vacant land, we could save the cost of demoing this stuff and then immediately turn a profit out of it. You see like all my numbers are messed up on this. Last one for now. Same idea. Again, so yeah, that's a shipping container house. This is actually like a really dated rendering. Like I was saying earlier, really difficult to just build a structure on top of an existing foundation, but really expensive to remove the foundation and start from scratch. So on one of the homes that we've got, that's actually the updated rendering. This is the house. It had like an illegal tire or a car chop shop in the backyard for the longest time. Anyways, it's like a bungalow. It's not made of terribly like high quality materials. Instead of having a basement, which is pretty traditional for Michigan homes, it's got a crawl space. So you've got your just like cinder block foundation and then dirt right at ground level. So what's kind of like a cool opportunity there is, instead of using the existing foundation to like plant your house on, you can take these things called sonotubes. It's just like a cylinder full of cement, and you pop it into the footprint, pretty much just like in the dirt. Think like if you're looking at a house on a pier or something, how it's like floating on top of these posts. Stick that into the footprint of the existing foundation, retrofit your shipping container on top of that, and then connect it to the existing foundation using a wooden porch. It turns out porches are like really not regulated to the same extent as like occupied space. And that way you're able to effectively repurpose your foundation, and just plug your utility lines back in, save on 2/3 of the cost of the demolition. And then, you know, the strategy that we're taking with this container home, I'll show you like a live photo of it. Where is it? It's like built right now. It's sitting in the Detroit Hamtramck assembly plant for General Motors. So, I mean, just kind of the way we did it, 80% of the materials are repurposed. At the end of the day, we're gonna have spent $10,000 to convert a blighted structure into a functional livable home, as opposed to just creating more vacant property. And what's kind of cool about this from like a larger social context is that, you know, in our neighborhood, we've got 70% of the residents are currently renting the structures that they're in. You know, now that we're like the next big area coming up, we're just slated for gentrification. And when you've got a majority of your long-term residents without an equitable stake in the neighborhood, that's just like not going to be an inclusive future that everybody can really benefit from. So creating homes that are economically accessible, and depending on what kind of pricing model you use, you know, there are nonprofit mortgage companies that can really undercut the market, at least until like, you know, somebody that's structurally disadvantaged like got to a point where I've had it explained to me before. I'm not even gonna try, but it's a thing. So, I mean, 10 grand land contract, you can potentially like own a home for less money than you're currently paying in rent from, you know, your neighborhood slumlord who's not even paying the taxes on the property that you're living in. This happens all the time, by the way. 2 of our neighbors have lost their homes while living in them, like found out when the new owner knocked on the door and informed them that they were going to be leaving because their landlord wasn't paying the taxes. So this has value, I guess, in like that standpoint. It also kind of ties into a larger, I guess, like national conversation that we're having about like what kind of space people actually need to live in. Detroit's pretty notorious for its just enormous number of multi-family flats, right? Like the housing stock is huge, it's old. If you are not like wealthy or highly skilled at renovations and repairs and maintenance, I mean, like there's just no way that this is gonna be like an affordable situation for you, especially with an aging population. I mean, most of the, 60-something% of the households that are just occupied are occupied by between 1 and 2 people, and these are all multifamily flats. Like that is not a good situation. I mean, you know people that spend all their money just trying to like have a barely functional situation. So the goal with this guy is really just to, you know, pilot, right? Because like this could totally suck to live in. We'll find out. We're planting it in a few weeks. And if it doesn't, right, it's just an interesting kind of like alternative to the existing housing strategy that we use. And it deals with blight, and it protects the neighborhood against gentrification, possibly, depending if people are interested at all. I think it's pretty cool. I'm just gonna keep moving on. I swear to God, this was organized at one point. That building with the mural on it, now I'm like wondering if we've even got, I'm just gonna like go with it and I'm gonna stop using the PowerPoint. So building with a mural on it, renovating it to just be a community resource center. We're gonna have, you know, administrative space, educational space focused on like nutritional literacy, agriculture, skill acquisition, and food prep. You know, there's like kind of this full cycle of like food, right? You don't just want to like grow something that's super healthy and then deep fry it, right? Like it's all kind of tied in together. One of the cool things, I guess, that we're trying to go with it is the incorporation of a for-profit subsidiary business that's owned by the nonprofit. It'll essentially be a like phase 1 cafe, phase 2, you know, awesome restaurant that takes over the world, because that's what we're all about. And I guess like the idea there is, if urban agriculture, at least like on a single layer, can't necessarily justify itself economically, maybe it can immediately convert itself into prepared foods, and then you get like a higher bang for your buck. Mix that in with some vertical growing, tie it in with like the need for green space in any sort of modern day development model, and you like are creating a real home for urban ag that really works in tandem with existing infrastructure. So that's what we're going on with the center. Interesting, I guess, like fun facts about the nonprofit and how we've gone about everything. To date, not a single person has ever been paid at our nonprofit. We don't have any money. All the money that we do have, we've won from Facebook contests. Literally, there's like this huge new movement where the corporations used to kind of do these behind closed doors grants, and now they've realized that they get a higher return on their like investment in terms of publicity if they make nonprofits duke it out against each other in social media forums, which is really interesting from like I guess, nonprofit whose leadership tends to be in their 20s. We don't have the terribly well-developed professional networks. We don't have, like a track record where any, granting agency worth its salt would be comfortable funding us. But what we do have is extremely well-developed like social networks online, and we can win the living crap out of some contests. I mean, we've brought in nearly $100,000 just through winning these alone, and that's interesting. I mean, you used to think that like in order to do successful like pro-social nonprofit work, you had to like have access to extreme wealth, real resources. I mean, you're supposed to like have training and know what you're doing. Not that like we're a terribly functional example, but I mean like if we've done anything, I mean it's a testament to the fact that that's not true, right? All of the work that we do, we pretty much learn off of YouTube and the internet. And these are things I also shouldn't be saying when it comes to like building renovations, but like we've got electricity and a fully wired house. How do you think that happened? YouTube. And then we pay somebody $100 who's like licensed to come in and make sure we're not about to set everything on fire, right? And it turns out we're doing pretty well, which is cool. So I guess like a larger narrative behind the nonprofit is really like abandoning the idea that like in order to make some sort of social change and impact in the world around you, really, only those in privileged positions can do that. Not to say that I'm not in that already. I mean, I'm like opted into this very odd lifestyle, which takes privilege in the first place. But it's interesting. I don't know. I think there's something like really valuable behind it. I think over the next decade, we're really going to see the, I guess, way nonprofits are structured really start to change. I don't know if we've necessarily figured out the solution, but I think we're probably a little closer to what things are going to start looking like, just as traditional nonprofit funding models stop existing. But maybe this is like some weird like conspiracy theory that I have, but I don't know, that might not be true. I'm like very excited for somebody else to ask me a question because I'm just like talking right now. Oh, we've also recruited over 5,000 volunteers using Facebook and over 50,000 volunteer hours of service, which is pretty cool. Okay.
Microphone's here. I've got a question right here.
Hi, yeah, I had a quick question. Looking at your model of turning the foundation into a water catchment system, I don't know how you manage kind of the inventory that you produce off the farm, but have you considered cold storage, like a cellar type situation with that foundation?
We tend to just stick those in the basements of houses without tearing them down, right? We've got plenty of housing stock that's eligible just for being remodeled, and they all have basements. So that's probably what we. I mean, you could do that. I mean, why not just put some doors over it, right? It's just shapes.
Yes, right here, question. Wait a minute, the microphone's coming at you.
I was just wondering, I've heard that there's also some initiatives in Detroit to replant trees, reforest some of the areas. Are you involved in any of that, or is that true?
Yeah, God, the Greening of Detroit's a pretty big nonprofit. There's trees everywhere. I don't see the need right now because like we're dealing with having to like take them down because they've just not been managed, you know, or maintained for decades. Yes, lots of trees are happening. It is going to be a very green space. It already is.
Yes, sir, right here.
I would think that the change that you generate in that area would attract a lot of attention from developers. Do you get people
Say that one more time?
The change that you're generating in that area would attract the attention of developers?
About once a week, I have one approach me asking to buy everything from me.
Well, and not only that, but I would think you'd find someone that would partner with you with the same kind of social conscience that you've got in terms of trying to
Use it as a centerpiece of a development, right?
Well, yeah, but not gentrification. I'm not really talking about that. But someone has the same kind of motive that you do in terms of assisting the neighborhood and that sort of stuff, and using this as a springboard to generate a third place or to generate some additional housing stock or whatever, kind of like you're doing with the container house.
Yeah, we tend to call that, I guess, group the benevolent speculators, right? And usually, I mean, they start off as really good conversations, and what it ends up happening is somebody ends up buying a bunch of property and sitting on it forever and a day, and effectively holding back the very development they were trying to encourage. And then it usually turns into a like, oh, well, you can farm on my land and effectively make it so that I don't have to pay a lawn mowing bill, right? Like, how lucky for you. Yeah. But that is probably the route that we're going to need to go. I think there is a lot of value just from that placemaking like perspective. I mean, it's kind of magical, the idea of getting to like live in a house with a view of an urban farm, right? I mean, you get everything. You get your like rural urban or like rural agriculture thing. Meanwhile, you've got like city skyline in the background. You're right next to public transit. I mean, you're like in a like urban core. And I think it's probably like the best of both worlds. I think we're going to see a lot of it moving forward.
Hey, Tyson, let me ask you a question. Mm-hmm. What about the potential for people coming to Detroit, the tourism, the people that come by and learn this? What about the potential for urban farming conferences? Have you thought about getting into an educational initiative that would be maybe for your for-profit, but maybe partnering with the Detroit Convention and Visitors Bureau or others, the people that are interested in it, to come walk through and see this model?
Well, effectively, that is sort of what happens on a like grassroots basis. I mean, if you look at like the distribution of where volunteers come from, or like where the people getting tours come from, it tends to be like 30% Detroit proper long-term residents, and then like Europe. It's all Europe. It's crazy. They're obsessed with it. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Got that kind of interest, then perhaps you could do again conferences, guest speakers, and so forth to bring people in as a revenue generator for you as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value just in like having that space too, right? I mean, you create something people want to be at, and it becomes the perfect destination to host stuff.
Yes, ma'am, back here.
Are you familiar with the Project for Public Spaces, PPS?
Maybe.
They're out of New York. I attended a conference in Cleveland a couple of years back, and they are doing a lot of what you are doing. They had a lot of blight, and they were able to, this was fascinating to me in that they had a very willing government that were able to change ordinances and other things that allowed them
I don't know if we're going to have that in Detroit anytime soon.
Well, you might, as a matter, there's a guy at Eastern Market who's into that public.
Dan Carmody?
I know Randall Fogelman from Eastern Market. I met him at the PPS, but that's neither here nor there. You should look and see. I just find it very interesting what they're doing. Also, they're a little bit further along than you are in that they have turned that into an agro-tourism kind of deal, and they have brought
Eastern
in.
Market?
No, Cleveland. Sorry,
Oh,
I
okay.
switched back on you. And so I was part of a very large group that had an international placemaking conference there, and that toured around on these buses of all of these areas, exactly like what you're showing. That they had done that, and it had grown over several years for a very, very large scale.
It's weird how so many of our like urban cities, like our dense urban areas, just tanked, right? I think Detroit may be like the biggest example just in terms of like square mileage, but I mean, it's not like we're dealing with necessarily new problems. This has happened 100 times.
Okay, we have
And
a
yet
question in the
we never
back.
talk.
I'm very inspired by your presentation today.
Oh, good.
I'm working on a similar project. It's revitalized America's largest gated community, Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. So we're trying, and a lot of words that you have been using really hit home with me, like creating destination, placemaking, and the infill projects. So my question is, as you are changing the function of the parcels, the vacant parcels from residential to, I don't know if you
Blue and
intend
green
them to be
infrastructure,
civic places or the third place, do you have to work with rezoning that area, changing the function of those parcels?
So, on record, yes. Detroit's probably starting to get to that space where like that stuff really is regulated, but historically, no. I don't think I could identify a single house that had a certificate of occupancy in our entire neighborhood, which is like kind of what you need to like live in a structure legally or rent it out. I don't know, it's hard to like explain just how vacant and kind of like absent things are there sometimes, at least from like a regulatory standpoint. There does tend to be a lot of wiggle room in the zoning ordinance, though. I mean, like, we're all, what is it? I'm gonna forget it already, but like under the type of residential that we are, technically like nonprofit community resource center qualifies as like a living situation. You know, you can use the infrastructure that way. But there's like some other groups like Hostel Detroit, which was Detroit's first hostel, just had a nightmare and a half, and actually like had to they had to change laws to exist. But they did it. They're very tired.
We have time for one more question. We get this lady in the back, and then we'll let everyone else who has questions come visit with Tyson after the presentation. Go right ahead.
I saw a designation on one of the slides, off-grid, and I'm wondering if you have or hope to include some solar.
Yeah, we've got one of our structures that we just got donated. We're doing an off-grid retrofit. So the idea is to, you know, take a 100-year-old home completely off-grid, but in a way that's sort of like relevant to both millennials that are sort of opting into this like non-traditional living, but also to just like structurally disadvantaged peoples who need to stop paying utility bills they can't afford because it's insane in Detroit. I mean, 4 of my board members live without any utilities whatsoever. They've got $4,000 electric bills. I mean, like, you don't even want to know about the water bill, and it's just the way things add up in the city. So yes, we're all about solar, wind, like biodigestion, interesting combinations between the two. Like there's this really cool wind fence that you can do where you've essentially got these like ribbons that'll like run along the length of whatever you post it to. And then when the wind blows, you get like a tiny amount of vibration, and that'll generate energy. We're essentially going to be like trial and erroring stuff until we can create something that like doesn't seem like you're roughing it, but is in fact completely off-grid.